Chapter 11 of Life of Henry David Thoreau by Henry Salt. Thus, as we have seen, the most vigorous protest ever raised against that artificiality in life and literature which is one of the chief dangers of our complex civilization proceeded not from some sleepy old-world province which might have been expected to be unable to keep pace with a progressive age, but from the heart of the busiest and most advanced nation on the globe. It is to Yankee land that we owe the example and the teaching of the Bachelor of Nature. The personality of Thoreau is so singular and so unique that it seems useless to attempt, as some have done, to draw out any elaborate parallel between his character and that of other social or unsocial reformers, who have protested against some prevalent tendency in the age in which they lived. Those who are interested in seeking for literary prototypes may perhaps, in this case, find one in Abraham Cowley, a member of that school of gnomic poets with which Thoreau was so familiar, and moreover a zealous lover of the peace and solitude of nature. He lived in close retirement during the later years of his life, and his death, which, like Thoreau's, was due to a cold caught while he was botanizing, is attributed by his biographer to his very delight in the country and the fields, which he had long fancied above all other pleasures. Some of Cowley's remarks in his essays on solitude are conceived in a spirit very similar to that of Thoreau. The first minister of state, he says, has not so much business in public as a wise man in private. If the one has little leisure to be alone, the other has less leisure to be in company. The one has but part of the affairs of one nation, the other all the works of God and nature under his consideration. And elsewhere he expresses the wish that men could unravel all they have woven, that we might have our woods and our innocence again, instead of our castles and our policies. But these parallels between two men of widely different periods and purposes can contain nothing more than slight and superficial resemblances. Nor, except for his general connection with Emerson and the Transcendentalists, is it more easy to match Thoreau with any ethical writer of his own generation. As a poet-naturalist, however, Thoreau is distinctly akin to Richard Jefferies and other writers of that school. Jefferies' character was richer and more sensuous than Thoreau's, but they had the same mystic religious temperament, the same impatience of tradition and conventionality, the same passionate love of woods and fields and streams, and the same gift of brilliant language in which to record their observations. It is curious to compare these modern devotees of country life with the old-fashioned naturalists of whom Isaac Walton and Gilbert White are the most illustrious examples. While the honest old angler prattles on contentedly, like the babbling streams by which he spent his days, with here and there a pious reflection on the beneficence of Providence and the adaptation of means to ends, and while the kindly naturalist of Selborne devotes himself absolutely and unreservedly to the work of chronicling the fauna and flora of the district about which he writes, these later authors have brought to the treatment of similar subjects a far deeper insight into the beauty and pathos of nature, and a power of poetical description which was not dreamed of by their simple yet no less devoted predecessors. It is mainly to Thoreau in America and to Jeffreys in England that we owe the recognition and study of what may be called the poetry of natural history, a style of thought and writing which is peculiar to the last 30 or 40 years. The study of nature has, of course, been from time immemorial one of the great subjects of poetry, but so far it was nature in its more general aspects. It was not till comparatively recent years that there was discovered to be poetry also in the accurate and patient observation of natural phenomena. We have now learnt that natural history, which was formerly regarded as a grave and meritorious study of a distinctly prosaic kind, may be made to yield material for the most imaginative and poetical reflections. When Thoreau died in 1862, Richard Jefferies was a boy of 14, busily engaged among his native Wiltshire downs in laying the foundation of his wonderful knowledge of outdoor life. As far as I am aware, there is no mention of Thoreau in his writings, nor any indication that he had read him. Yet one is often struck by suggestive resemblances in their manner of thought. Take, for instance, that half-serious, half-whimsical contention of Thoreau's, which has probably been more misunderstood than any other of his sayings, that Concord, in its natural features, contains all the phenomena that travelers have noted elsewhere, and compare it with the following opinion expressed by Jeffreys. It has long been one of my fancies that this country is an epitome of the natural world, and that if anyone has come really into contact with its productions and is familiar with them, and what they mean and represent, then he has a knowledge of all that exists on the earth. In reading these words, one has a difficulty in remembering that they were not written by Thoreau. The association of Thoreau's name with the district in which he lived and died is likely to become closer and closer as the years go on. Great nature lovers, it has been truly remarked, have the faculty of stamping the impress of their own character on whole regions of country, so that there are certain places which belong by supreme and indisputable right to certain persons who have made them peculiarly and perpetually their own. As the Lake District is inseparably connected with the names of the poets who dwelt and wrote there, as the Scotch borderland owns close allegiance to Scott, and the Ayrshire fields to Burns, and as the little Hampshire village of Selborne is the inalienable property of Gilbert White, so the thoughts of those who visit Concord turn inevitably to Thoreau. Thoreau's affections and genius, says one of his admirers, were so indissolubly bound up with this country that now he is gone he presents himself to my mind as one of these local genii or deified men whom the Scandinavian mythology gave as guardians to the northern coasts and mountains. These beings kept off murrain from the cattle and sickness from men. They made the nights sweet and salubrious, and the days productive. If Thoreau had lived in the early ages of Greece, he would have taken his place in the popular imagination along with his favorite god Pan. That a personality so stubbornly and aggressively independent as Thoreau's would be a stumbling block to many critics, good and bad alike, might have been foreseen, and indeed was foreseen from the first. What an easy task it would be, said one who understood him unusually well, for a lively and not entirely scrupulous pen to ridicule his notions and raise such a cloud of ink in the clear medium as entirely to obscure his true and noble traits. Footnote: John Weiss, Christian Examiner, July 1865. End footnote. Just 3 months after these prophetic words were written appeared Mr. Lowell's well-known criticism of Thoreau in the North American Review, afterwards reprinted in my study windows, an essay which was a masterpiece of hostile innuendo and ingenious misrepresentation, written with all the cleverness and brilliancy of which its author was capable. Mr. Lowell, who had been one of Thoreau's fellow students at Harvard University, had held friendly relations with him after the close of their college career, had certainly not made the discovery of his intellectual feebleness at the time of the publication of the Week on the Concord River in 1849, for in that same year he highly eulogized him in the Massachusetts Quarterly as one of those rare persons who, in a utilitarian age, can still feel and express the almost indefinable charm of wild nature, and further spoke of him in a tone of much personal friendliness. 10 years later, however, this friendly acquaintance was sharply terminated by a difference which arose, as already mentioned, about an article contributed by Thoreau to the Atlantic Monthly, then under Mr. Lowell's editorship, and we have it stated on Emerson's authority that Mr. Lowell never forgave Thoreau for having wounded his self-consciousness, presumably in a correspondence that arose on this subject. I make no apology for calling attention to this nexus of events, because it furnishes the explanation of the otherwise strange animus which underlies Lowell's article. Brilliant as is the view obtained from my study windows, it ought to be more generally known that there is at least one pane therein which is discolored and distorted, and which cannot be trusted by those literary students who would keep an unprejudiced outlook. A skulker is the phrase in which Mr. R.L. Stevenson summed up Thoreau's character in his essay in Men and Books. But as he himself admits in the later written preface that he had quite misread Thoreau through lack of sufficient knowledge of his life, there is no reason why admirers of Walden should feel disturbed at the bestowal of that singularly inappropriate epithet. Other critics, again, while enjoying much of Thoreau's writing, have been haunted by a suspicion that he was the victim of a theatrical self-consciousness, and that he became a hermit rather to attract attention than to avoid it. We have a mistrust of the sincerity of the St. Simeon Stylites, said a contemporary reviewer of Walden, and suspect that they come down from the pillars in the night-time when nobody is looking at them. Diogenes placed his tub where Alexander would be sure of seeing it, and Mr. Thoreau ingeniously confesses that he went out to dine. So inconceivable does it seem to those who have not considered, much less practiced, a simple and frugal life, that a man should deliberately, and for his own pleasure, abandon what they believe to be luxuries and comforts, that critics are always discovering some far-fetched and non-existent object in the Walden experiment, while they miss its true and salutary lessons. It seems scarcely necessary nowadays to rebut the absurd charge of selfishness, which used once to be brought against Thoreau. But the charge still crops up now and then in belated circles of thought. The general impression of the reader, says the Church Quarterly Review, is that, while the descriptions of scenery are extremely beautiful, and the notes about animal life and plants are most interesting, yet the man himself is thoroughly selfish, quite out of sympathy with men and their sufferings, barbaric if not animal in his tastes, and needlessly profane. Footnote: October 1895. End footnote. Thoreau's lack of ambition is another point that has caused him to be much misunderstood. Even Emerson gave his sanction to this rather futile complaint. "I cannot help counting it as a fault in him," he said, "that he had no ambition. Wanting this, instead of engineering for all America, he was the captain of a huckleberry party. Pounding beans is good to the end of pounding empires one of these days, but if, at the end of years, it is still only beans." But the obvious answer to this criticism is that in Thoreau's case it was not only beans. The chapter on the bean field in Walden is one of the most imaginative and mystic in all his works. "It was no longer beans that I hoed," he says, "nor I that hoed beans." For the object of his quest and labor was not the actual huckleberry, nor the tangible bean, but the glorified and idealized fruit of a lifetime spent in communion with nature, which imparted to his writings a freshness and fragrance as of nature itself. In this matter Thoreau was the wiser judge of his own powers, and conferred a far greater benefit on the human race by writing Walden than he could have done by engineering for all America. After all that has been said in this book of Thoreau's great debt to Emerson, it may, I think, be added without prejudice or ingratitude that the common misapprehension of Thoreau's character must be partly traced back to Emerson's biographical sketch, and to his unfortunate manner of editing the letters and poems. That excessive insistence on Thoreau's stoicism, to the subordination of his gentler and more affectionate traits, has done much to postpone a general recognition of the deep tenderness that underlay the rugged nature and rough sayings of the author of Walden. It is said that as Thoreau's character matured and hardened, his friendship with Emerson grew somewhat Roman and austere, and we may be permitted to doubt whether Emerson had really gauged his friend's mind as fully as he imagined. That Thoreau, on his side, was sensible of Emerson's limitations is proved by the opinion which he expressed to a friend that Emerson would be classed by posterity with Sir Thomas Browne, an estimate far lower than the usual one. And here I would hazard the suggestion, though well aware that it must at present seem fantastic, that Thoreau's genius will eventually be at least as highly valued as Emerson's. No sane critic could for a moment doubt the mighty influence which Emerson's great and beneficent intellect wielded among his contemporaries, or dream of comparing Thoreau with him as a 19th century power. But the class of mind which has the most lasting hold on men's interest and homage is not always, and not often, the same as that which rules contemporary thought. And in the long run the race is to the most brilliant rather than to the most balanced of writers, to the poet rather than to the philosopher, to him who most keenly challenges the curiosity and imagination of his readers. Of all the Concord group, by far the most inspired, stimulating, and vital personality is Thoreau's. And when time has softened down the friction caused by superficial blemishes and misunderstandings, the world will realize that it was no mere Emersonian disciple, but a mastermind and heart of hearts who left that burning message to his fellow men. The sum of the whole matter is that Thoreau had a clear and definite object before him, which he followed with inflexible earnestness, and that his very faults and oddities subserved the main purpose of his life. There is a providence in his writings, says John Weiss, which ought to protect him from the complaint that he was not somebody else. No man ever lived who paid more ardent and unselfish attention to his business. If pure minds are sent into the world upon errands, with strict injunction not to stray by other paths, Thoreau certainly was one of these elect. A great deal of criticism is inspired by the inability to perceive the function and predestined quality of the man who passes in review. It only succeeds in explaining the difference between him and the critic. Such a decided fact as a man of genius is, ought to be gratefully accepted and interpreted. That Thoreau's doctrines, no less than his character, have their shortcomings and imperfections, few will be disposed to deny. He could not realize, or perhaps did not care to realize, the immense scope and complexity of the whole social problem. He had scarcely the data or opportunities for doing so. And in any case, his intensely individualistic nature would probably have incapacitated him. We therefore cannot look to him for any full and satisfactory solution of the difficulties by which our modern civilization is surrounded, but it would be a great error to conclude that we are not to look to him at all. If it is true that the deadlock resulting from the antagonism of labor and capital can never be relieved without external legislation, it is equally true that there can be no real regeneration of society without the self-improvement of the individual man. It is idle to assert that the one or the other must come first. Both are necessary, and the two must be carried on side by side. In Thoreau, the social instinct was deficient or undeveloped, but on the other hand, he has set forth the gospel of the higher intellectual individualism with more force and ability than any modern writer. If it be but a half-truth that he preaches, it is none the less a half-truth of the utmost moment and significance. As to Thoreau, says Edward Carpenter, in England's Ideal, a volume worthy to rank with Walden in the literature of plain living and high thinking, the real truth about him is that he was a thorough economist. He reduced life to its simplest terms, and having, so to speak, labor in his right hand and its reward in his left, he had no difficulty in seeing what was worth laboring for and what was not, and no hesitation in discarding things which he did not think worth the time or trouble of production. We have seen that he was not, like Emerson, a philosopher of wide, far-reaching sympathies and cautious judicial temperament, but rather a prophet and monitor, outspoken, unsparing, irreconcilable. He addressed himself to the correction of certain popular tendencies which he perceived to be mischievous and delusive, and preached what may be comprehensively termed a gospel of simplicity, in direct antagonism to the prevailing tone of a self-indulgent and artificial society. Who will venture to say that the protest was not needed then, that it is not still more needed now? The years which have passed, says a well-known writer, since Thoreau came back out of Walden Wood to attend to his father's business of pencil-making, have added more than the previous century to the trappings and baggage of social life, which he held and taught by precept and example, that men would be both better and happier for doing without. And while we succumb and fall year by year more under the dominion of these trappings, and life gets more and more overlaid with one kind and another of upholsteries, the idea of something simpler and nobler probably never haunted men's minds more than at this time. Footnote: Mr. T. Hughes, Academy, 17th of November, 1877. End footnote. Herein lies the strength of Thoreau's position, that the very excess of the evil which turns our supposed comforts into discomforts and our luxuries into burdens must at last induce us to listen to the voice of sobriety and reason. As to the manner in which Thoreau expresses his convictions, nothing more need here be said, except that his style is justly adapted to his sentiments. His knock-down blows at current opinion are likened by Mr. R. L. Stevenson to the posers of a child, which leave the orthodox in a kind of speechless agony. They know the thing is nonsense. They are sure there must be an answer, yet somehow they cannot find it. We may shrewdly doubt whether the conclusive answer will ever be forthcoming, but it is something that people should be at all aroused from the complacent lethargy of custom and tradition. Thoreau is thus seen to have a quickening, stimulating, and, at times, exasperating effect as an ethical teacher. It is no part of his object to prophesy smooth things, to deal tenderly with the weaknesses of his readers, or even to explain those features of his doctrine which, from their novelty or unpopularity, are most likely to be misunderstood. This being so, his character and writings were certain to prove as distasteful to some readers as they are attractive to others. If he is a good deal misapplied at present, time will set that right. In conclusion, we see in Thoreau the extraordinary product of an extraordinary era. His strange, self-centered, solitary figure, unique in the annals of literature, challenges attention by its originality, audacity, and independence. He had, it has been well remarked, a constitutional no in him. He renounced much that other men held dear, and set his heart on objects which to the world seemed valueless. It was part of his mission to question, to deny, to contradict. But his genius was not only of the negative and destructive order. In an age when not one man in 1,000 had a real sympathy with nature, He attained to an almost miraculous acquaintance with her most cherished secrets. In an age of pessimism, when most men, as he himself expresses it, lead lives of quiet desperation, he was filled with an absolute confidence in the justice and benevolence of his destiny. In an age of artificial complexity, when the ideal is unduly divorced from the practical, and society stands in false antagonism to nature, he, a devout pantheist, saw everywhere simplicity, oneness, relationship. In his view, God was not to be considered apart from the material world, nor was man to be set above and aloof from the rest of creation and the lower forms of life. He tracked everywhere the same divine intelligence. In animate nature there was none, since all was instinct with the same universal spirit. It was his purpose, in a word, to civilize nature with the highest intuitions of the mind, which show her simplicity to restless and artificial men. This ideal he pursued, as we have seen, with a rare courage, sincerity, and self-devotion. Whether he succeeded or failed in his endeavor is a question which time alone can fully answer. His example and doctrines were coldly and incredulously received during his lifetime by most of those with whom he came in contact, and his comparatively early death cut him off, in the prime of his vigor, from reaping the harvest he had sown with such patience and assiduity. So far his career, like that of most idealists, must be confessed a failure. But these are not the tests by which idealists, least of all Thoreau, can be judged. For he enjoyed, in the first place, that priceless and inalienable success which consists in perfect serenity of mind and contentment with one's own fortunes. If the day and night, he says in Walden, are such that you greet them with joy, and life emits a fragrance like flowers and sweet-scented herbs, is the more elastic, starry, and immortal, that is your success. And secondly, he had the assurance, which is seldom denied to a great man, that the true value of his work would ultimately be recognized and appreciated. During the period that has passed since his death, his fame has steadily increased both in America and England, and is destined to increase yet further. The blemishes and mannerisms of Thoreau's character are written on its surface, easy to be read by the indifferent passer-by who may miss the strong and sterling faculties that underlie them. His lack of geniality, his rusticity, his occasional littleness of tone and temper, his impatience of custom, degenerating sometimes into injustice, his too sensitive self-consciousness, his trick of overstatement in the expression of his views, these were incidental failings which did not mar the essential nobility of his nature. We shall do wisely in taking him just as he is, neither shutting our eyes to his defects nor greatly deploring their existence, but remembering that in so genuine and distinctive an individuality the faults have their due place and proportion no less than the virtues. Had he added the merits he lacked to those which he possessed, had he combined the social with the individual qualities, had he been more catholic in his philosophy and more guarded in his expression, then we might indeed have admired him more, but should scarcely have loved him so well, for his character, whatever it gained in fullness, would have missed the peculiar freshness and piquancy which are now its chief attraction. Whatever else he might have been, he would not have been Thoreau. End of Chapter 11. End of Life of Henry David Thoreau by Henry Salt.